Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian. We are moving right along with Sherman's biography, where he and Grant tried to devise a plan to capture Vicksburg. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop, or join the Patreon page. Every little bit helps. After Sherman's last debacle in the swamps of Mississippi, he became concerned that Grant didn't understand politics. The Northern public and newspapers were exasperated that Vicksburg hadn't been captured yet, but President Lincoln was standing by Grant. But how long would that last? Sherman advised Grant to move part of the army back to Memphis and start the expedition from there, with simultaneous assaults against the city from different directions. However, Sherman underestimated Grant's political savvy. Grant knew that any withdrawal, whether strategic or not, would not look good in the eyes of the public or the newspapers. He must fight it out where he was. Grant came up with a plan. He would march his army along the west bank of the Mississippi River, while the Navy would steam past the Confederate guns at Vicksburg. Once the ships got south of the city, then they could ferry the troops across to the east side of the river. On the night of April 16th, the Navy began moving downriver. Sherman and some of his men waited south of the city on the west bank to help any men or boats who were hit during the maneuver. A transport boat named the Henry Clay floated by completely engulfed in fire. Sherman could do nothing but watch it pass, but he did rescue its pilot, who was floating by on a piece of debris. This moment solidified Sherman's high stance in the minds of soldiers and sailors. One of Sherman's biographers wrote, "What they particularly liked about him, as he demonstrated on the river to the fleet, was his willingness to be among them. He personally chose every tactical and campsite for his army, and no matter the weather, he was out looking over the ground. When not reconnoitering, Sherman frequented the camps, making sure his men were safe and content. He was clearly an enlisted man's general, and they appreciated his interest." McClernand's 13th Corps marched through the swamps of Louisiana to meet the transports south of Vicksburg. The boats passed by Grand Gulf, which was fortified, and made it to Bruinsburg. McClernand's troops would approach the river opposite that location. Meanwhile, Grant ordered Sherman back to Milliken's Bend. Sherman was to take his 15th Corps and perform a demonstration near Chickasaw Bayou, the place of Sherman's defeat earlier in the campaign. Sherman was greatly concerned over such a movement. Since it was a demonstration, it was intended to take pressure off the troops who were going to land at Bruinsburg. However, Sherman knew that the Northern public, because of the newspapers, would see it as another defeat and blame him for it. Grant acknowledged the political risk, but he needed Sherman to launch this demonstration north of Vicksburg. On April 29th, a naval squadron and 10 of Sherman's regiments proceeded up the Yazoo River toward Snyder's Bluff. Sherman landed soldiers and threatened the position, forcing the Confederates to reinforce those locations. On May 1st, Sherman received a message from Grant recalling him. Grant felt that Sherman's actions had sufficiently worked and now needed him for the invasion of Mississippi. Because of the precarious supply situation, Sherman loaded his men down with food and kept up a steady supply line between Milliken's Bend and Grand Gulf. He would arrive at Grand Gulf on May 7th, having marched 83 miles. Grant contemplated linking up with Nathaniel Banks from Louisiana to capture Port Hudson, but it would take a month for Banks to be ready. Not willing to give the Confederates that much time to react, Grant decided to move against Vicksburg alone. This would turn out to be the best decision for Grant. John C. Pemberton, the commander of the Vicksburg defenses, was under instructions from the President of the Confederacy to hold Vicksburg at all costs. Commander of the Western Department of the Confederacy, Joseph E. Johnston, wanted Pemberton to help concentrate forces in Mississippi to eliminate Grant before he got to Vicksburg. The Confederates could muster 50,000 men if they were concentrated, a formidable army to combat Grant, but neither man resolved the issue, and Pemberton would focus on Vicksburg. Johnston commanded troops at Jackson, Mississippi, so Grant decided to eliminate the threat there, then proceed to Vicksburg. If not, he could be trapped between the two Confederate forces. Sherman and his 15th Corps marched toward the state capital, with Grant accompanying the Corps. The Union troops arrived at Jackson on May 14th and drove the Confederates away from the city. When Sherman entered the city, a businessman approached him, asking him not to destroy his hotel, that he was a loyal citizen. Sherman told him that the hotel's name identified the loyalty of the hotel owner. The businessman changed the name of the hotel from the United States Hotel to the Confederate Hotel when the war began. Sherman told him that he had no plans to burn the property despite his disloyalty. However, when Sherman left the city, the hotel was in flames. Sherman surmised that it was some of the troops who had been prisoners of war and passed through the city earlier in the conflict. The hotel refused to give them food, and that was the reason the soldiers burnt the hotel. Sherman didn't like his soldiers doing that without orders, but he didn't dwell on it. Sherman favored controlled destruction. Soldiers in his command were not allowed to forage for their private use, and any foraging would be done with strict officer control. But stragglers and dregs of the army performed these acts, despite Sherman's orders against it. He would write, "The destruction of corn or forage and provision in the enemy's country is a well-established law of war, and as justifiable as the destruction of private cotton by the Southern Confederacy, and we are forced to invade, and we must keep the war south until they are not only ruined and exhausted, but also humbled in pride and spirit." Sherman missed out on the Battle of Champion Hill, but approached Vicksburg by a northern route. Near Bolton, Sherman entered a yard to get himself something to drink. As he sat on his horse, he noticed a book on the ground. A soldier handed it to him. It was a copy of the United States Constitution. On the title page was written the name Jefferson Davis. The land had been purchased by then Senator Davis, and now his copy of the Constitution was a Union general's war prize. Grant and Sherman were racing Pemberton to get to Vicksburg. At Haynes Bluff, the two Union generals surveyed the abandoned works of the Confederates. Sherman said to Grant that up to now he had felt no positive assurance of success, but he knew now that they had just completed one of the greatest campaigns in history. No matter what still lay ahead, this was a complete and successful campaign. The fight for Vicksburg wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but Sherman finally saw hope in the military situation. By May 18th, Pemberton and his 30,000 soldiers were in Vicksburg, dug in, while Grant and his 50,000 men lurked outside the fortifications. An assault was planned for 2 p.m. on May 19th. The corps of Sherman, McClernand, and James McPherson attacked the fortifications, but all three corps were driven back. During the fight, a teenage musician named Orion P. Howe came up to Sherman with his leg bleeding from a wound. He told the general that his regiment needed additional ammunition. Sherman said, "All right, my boy, I'll send them all they need, but you had better go and find a surgeon and let him fix you up." The young man saluted and began moving to the rear. A few moments later, the young man came running up to Sherman and told him the proper caliber of ammunition the regiment needed, worrying more about his regiment than his own safety. Grant, who stood by, had tears in his eyes as he watched the young man's actions. Later, Sherman would help the musician get an appointment to the Naval Academy. Undeterred by the repulse, Grant told his men to prepare for a 10 a.m. simultaneous attack on May 22nd. Sherman personally reconnoitered the ground and aimed his men at the right side of Stockade Redan. He sent 150 men, known as the Forlorn Hope, to advance ahead of the main battle line and place a plank across the ditch. Behind them came the infantry. Sherman himself advanced to within 200 yards of the fort to monitor the attack. 2 times the Union soldiers placed flags on the wall of the fort, but they were driven back. For 2 hours they fought, but could not break into the fortifications. When a messenger came to Grant from McClernand, informing him that he was on the verge of breaking through and requested diversionary help from Sherman and McPherson, Grant was skeptical. However, Sherman insisted that they must help out McClernand. The attacks by McPherson and Sherman costed more lives and didn't lead to a breakthrough in McClernand's front. A controversy emerged as to how close McClernand actually was to breaking through. Sherman and Grant believed that he had exaggerated his success, which made Sherman despise McClernand even more. However, McClernand's men did make significant headway in attacking the entrenchments, capturing part of them. Nevertheless, this caused a bigger rift between Sherman and McClernand.